So, what we didn't have time to discuss was actually how you play this. And so, we take a look at the beginning. So, John, when you played this chord. What did the right hand play?
First, the top two notes.
Top two notes, like this. Uh-huh. Okay. So, what you should know is that there are two sources for this piece. There are two manuscripts in particular that are very rich sources for the early North German preambulum. One of them is in the Lüneburg tablatures, KN 20715. This piece is in there, it's the number 46. And also from the Lunar tabulatures, from the B series, B3 has many preludia in it. And this piece is also there. Both sources are in German tablature. And it's the Lunar manuscript that has some extra indications of performance, including fingering. So for the first chord, the soprano voice should be played with the third finger of the right hand. There's a 3 there in the source. So this encourages you immediately not to play that with the right hand. And of course, the modern edition follows what we were talking about before, this tendency to divide the voices into 2 plus 2, and we see that reflected here. However, this arrangement, so that the right hand plays and the left hand plays, and then the third finger plays the D, and there's an ornament sign. The ornament sign has the 2 slashes, so it could be possibly okay. So then this, if that's the arrangement, then the first question that you might have is, well, does this mean that you play on a separate keyboard the right hand? Or do you play all on one keyboard? So the question of 2 keyboards played at the same time in the preludium is very interesting, because we think maybe this was done in the later preludium when you have long passaggi in 2 voices. You can play them on 2 separate plenum indications, and then maybe, for instance, things like that, or and such things. But what about the early preludium? Maybe they played on 2 keyboards at once, and in fact, there is some evidence of this from a manuscript coming from Lüneburg at the end of the 16th century that shows simultaneous playing, simultaneous taying on the 2 plenums. So let's try that idea. Okay. Now we have in bar 3 a diagonal mark. This is original from the Lunar manuscript, and this is an indication for dividing the hands. So at this point, you are told that the soprano and alto are played with the right hand. Okay? So if you do that, then you have to play on one keyboard. So for this particular piece, whoever wrote the copy of this manuscript wanted you to play on one keyboard. But to divide it like this, and so the beginning of bar 4 also has a hand divider, but then in bar 5, probably you take the alto voice with the left hand, So the reason I bring this up is because there's sometimes been discussion about playing on two keyboards at once with this repertoire. And I think that it should continue to be a nice open question. Maybe it could be done. Certainly the top voice has more ornamentation than the other voices. So somehow the top voice has this more melodic quality about it. But you can see it's very clear that the manuscript itself tells you not to play on two keyboards at once. It's just not possible to observe both the hand divisions and the fingerings and to come up with a performance for two keyboards for this. Then I gave you the fingering charts, a kind of simplified version of scaling fingering. And all I want to say about it for right now is that there is a remarkable consistency from one manuscript to the next, from one type of piece to the next, about the kind of fingering that was used. And the idea that the fingering that you find in the manuscript is only intended for beginners is not supported by the evidence across the spectrum of manuscripts when you see how many different kinds of manuscripts there are from this region, all reflecting essentially the same approach to the fingering. The fact that they show the same approach but different in details is simply because the fingering for this whole tradition involves the simultaneous applications of different kinds of systems. And we'll talk about this very shortly in connection with the Toccata in C. Ah, yes. That we touched on yesterday. So this is the Toccata in C. Yeah, we could 8-4-3-2. Good. Okay, so she wrote it in at the beginning. Lift the first chord, and then play 3-2-3-2-3-2-3. Right? Yeah. Are there any other possibilities here? To stay within the tradition?
5,
Yeah.
3, 2.
Yeah.
Or 3, 2, 3, 2.
Uh-huh. So, you have your choice. Either you take the approach of the paired fingering, or you take the approach of the position fingering. If you take the approach of the position fingering, then you just stay in the same position as long as you can, which means that you release the chord, and instead of beginning with 3, you begin with 5. Okay? Personally, I think her approach is maybe a little better because it means that you are using the fingering already as an advantage to produce the effect of the alternating bows, down bow and up bow. But you could still do it that way. And in bar 3, if it were not for the ornament sign, you might think, well, I could also start with 1. But yes, of course, that doesn't work. In bar 3, you have to begin with the third finger. Because the idea about the center of gravity is this. Each hand has a particular finger which is the center of gravity in this tradition. And for the right hand, it's the third finger. For the left hand, it's the second finger. And so we say that for the right hand, the third finger is the good finger. But then we have to keep in mind how that word is defined. And there are North German sources that define it for you, but there are other sources who will tell you that the good finger is the finger that plays the elements. So for the Spanish writers like Santa Maria, they say that the good finger is the finger that plays dobles and redobles. So you need to have that finger for the main note when you have, for instance, the ornament on this ascending scale. Okay, so then we just continue a little bit. Okay, good. And right where she stopped, this is an important moment because of the influence on our eyes of modern editions. If you look to the beginning of measure 10, you'll see that the soprano voice, 8th note, is beamed together with the 16th note that follows it. But what you're playing right underneath it, the B natural 8th note, isn't beamed to anything because it stops. In fact, however, that the G and the B 8th notes, that's one unit. And so don't think that you have to do something like this. That's the effect on our eyes of modern editions, is that we think we should do something like that. But the older notational practice would not do such a thing. It would just simply release if it were in score notation. If it were in tablature notation, it's the same issue. You don't, it's not connected in the tablature. So when you see an event like this, be sure to recognize the vertical event as being a unit. So you really, and this frees the hand wonderfully to begin with 3. Yep. It also means that when you start to play fast notes after a long note, that you don't slur them together, but that you initiate the motion fresh. Okay. You've been practicing, eh?
I try.
Yeah, because we had a little lesson on this, what, Sunday night it was?
Yes.
And she was playing it very well, but wasn't using this fingering at all. And so I'm impressed with how much you have changed in a short time. It's not easy to make changes like that in a short time, is it, when you have old habits coming through. So what she's clearly working with here is an approach to the paired fingering that does not group the notes into pairs or groups of slurred notes together. That's absolutely essential that you understand this, that the use of paired fingering does not in itself mean that you connect the two notes that you are playing from one finger to the next, at least not to connect it in the sense of modern legato, or as we say, slurred legato. You may be familiar with what used to be a famous book by Arnold Domech called The Interpretation of Music of the 17th and 18th Centuries. It's a very important book for its time. And he knew about old fingering patterns, especially in the English virginalists. And so he discusses this and gives a little written out example of old fingering and modern fingering. And I think it's the C major scale he shows with the modern fingering, where you go 1, 2, 3, 1, so it's 3 plus 5. And he groups it together and he says, well, that sounds terrible when you do that. And then he gives the same example for old fingering, but he writes slurs over all of the places where you play with consecutive fingers and says, and now this sounds really great, right? And it doesn't. And people didn't think so either when they read this. And so this really didn't help the acceptance of early fingering. And we heard it in many, many performances, especially when I was young. It was a very long time ago. And it was very common to hear all of the time playing these slurred pairs of notes. So instead of da-da-da-da-da-da, it was always like this. And many people, rightly, did not like this. And so they decided this early fingering just doesn't make any sense because it means this effect all the time. But, yeah?
There is a bit, I remember because it was in this year, I just got the book of Dolmetsch, and there is now Italian translation to this important book. And there was one of the first long playing with William Byrd's music. I don't remember English player. And the first piece of this was just because only in the introduction was just a new way of playing with old fingering. And the first piece was the Fantasia by Byrd in C. This was very nice. Yes, yes. And I remember the beginning was ta ta ra ta ra ta ra and the whole Fantasia was in this way. And this was a demonstration of Dolmetsch concept of old fingering. And it was a little bit, so I was 15, 16 years or something like this. And I was a little bit surprised by this. What is this? It's like people didn't have a good digestion before playing.
Yes. There was an even sadder example of a recording made in the early 60s by a violinist who was experimenting with old instruments, and he was very dedicated to this and to old techniques, and especially to the technique of the mezzo di voce. And I'm not even going to tell you his name. He worked very hard and his heart was in the right place, but he was not a good violinist. And on this recording you hear, I will now demonstrate the mezzo di voce here. And then there's a pause and he says, it took me 30 years to perfect that. But many times those people did a great service by awakening people's attention to new ideas. And sometimes you think, well, it's because they were not successful that many people were turned off. But I think there's another side. It's because they were not successful that many other people kept trying to see maybe it can be successful after all in a different way. And so I think that even in itself is a really good contribution. So we could hear that this is happening and you're playing, that you're trying very hard not to do this. And maybe you are like some of the other of us that find it most difficult to do that when you're descending.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is something I think we all still have to work at, is when you're descending in pairs fast to get this to happen. But there are some things to do. Let's try, we'll take a simpler sound and just, we'll make up our own piece and play da 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 da. Okay?
You said I can't turn.
We'll talk about that. So let's work what kind of sound we want first of all. So we want the sound of dee da 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 da. So in order to get that, we have to first of all take away any effect of ta tia 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 tia. And so this means, since the third finger is the good finger, you have to be putting your attention to the release of the third finger, so that you don't slur 3 into 4. So 3 has to be a little more active when you release. Da dee da dee da da. Like that. Good. So play da dee da 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 da. Nice, huh? Very nice. Do it 2 more times. Very, very nice. 1 more time. Now, what about turning the hand, or not? What has been your experience in these 2 days of experiment?
But it's much easier if you turn, then you make it more even, I think. Or?
So turning makes it more even?
No?
Could be. What about when you descend? Is it the same way?
You can just walk like
You can
this.
walk. I had a harpsichord teacher who firmly believed that that was the way the old fingering worked, was that you walk or run or trot up and down the keyboard by turning, and you just walk like this. And because he believed that, he thought it was no big deal, and therefore not so important to use this fingering, because you can get that effect any way you want, and it was easier for him and everybody else not to do it that way. So I think that if you were to work primarily with northern instruments, with northern actions, that you would not find it so much of an advantage to do that. And that the more you have kind of a real North German action, the more you find that to stay parallel with the keys gives you not only just as good a result, but also a greater sense of security in your contact with the key. And it doesn't mean that you are playing like that at all. But with lighter actions, what is your experience? With lighter actions, do you turn more?
I think this is my personal experience, that if you turn this anyway, you are less able to control everything from here. So most you stay parallel, and it's easier to have a better control of what you're doing. If you play this way, it's more complicated to feel the control.
You have to do this. This has to come out more.
Yes. There are some. This is interesting. There are some original paint or pictures of the 16th, 17th century Renaissance and Baroque of harpsichord players, spinet players, made by famous painters. So not just something in which you find sometimes the ladies, the spinet playing in this position.
Yes, that is true.
Exactly, French in this way. Yes, but it's also very strange that an amateur just try to do this. Normally somebody has to tell you, because normally you start to do this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not possible to tell from these paintings whether they are doing paired fingering or crossover fingering, because it uses the same fingers but in a different way. And this is an alternate to the paired finger in which you have 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. Instead, it's a fingering in which 2 and 4 are the good fingers, and the middle finger is in the middle, and you cross over. So you would start a scale 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3. And when you have this, then you are also obliged to turn. In fact, there are some sources that tell you to turn the hand in the direction that you are going to play. I interpret those directions as applying to crossover fingering rather than to what we would call the paired fingering. The crossover fingering is very interesting phenomenon. And it was practiced perhaps more in Southern Europe than elsewhere, but it was also, you also find it in some northern sources as well. So this means 3/4, 3/4, 3/4, 3/4. And here you have to turn a little bit, and you have to work to make it even. And I think the point of this fingering is that it should be quite smooth and quite even as a normal rule.